Dice, yeah, ay, ay.
Every now and then, a guest joins the show whose story feels like a quiet storm, gentle on the surface, but full of depth, wisdom, and the kind of honesty that stays with you long after the conversation ends. Today, that guest is novelist and former attorney Michelle Lerner, author of the beautiful book Ring. Michelle didn't always set out to write fiction. In fact, the very first seed of her novel arrived 20 years ago. Just an image on a train ride, someone walking through the snow towards a pillar, and a dog waiting there in the quiet. She didn't know it then, but that image would eventually collide with real life. Chronic neurological Lyme disease, years of isolation, anticipatory grief, pandemic lockdown, and the death of her closest friend. All while she was writing this book. But here's what makes Michelle's story special. Instead of breaking her, all of it opened a new kind of creativity. A lyrical novel built from vignettes, breathwork, somatic healing, grief that refused to follow a movie script timeline, and the complicated relationship between a grieving parent and a dog who refuses to let them disappear. Today we talk about what grief really looks like, why getting over it is a myth, how trauma sits in the body, and why animals sometimes reach us in ways humans can't. But we have this conversation in a way that's human, warm, curious, grounded, and surprisingly hopeful. If you've ever felt isolated, overwhelmed, or unsure of how to move forward while carrying something heavy, this episode will bring you comfort, clarity, and maybe even a new perspective on your own healing. This is the FYI I Am Damaged podcast. Meet Logan, the strong minded little elephant who learns that bravery isn't about being fearless, it's about believing in yourself even when you're scared. In this beautifully illustrated story, friends follow Logan through a colorful jungle as he learns to calm his worries, take deep breaths, and remind himself, I am strong, I am safe, I can do this. It's a story that helps kids, and maybe a few grown-ups too, find courage, mindfulness, and strength in their hearts. Logan, the strong-minded little elephant, by me, Oscar Luna. Available now at all major retailers and my publisher's bookstore, Milton and Hugo. Because it's up to every parent to show that their child deserves to know that strength starts from within. Michelle, if you think back to the first seed of Ring, what's happening in your own life or body that made this particular story impossible to ignore?
That's a complicated question because the first seed of the story came to me probably 20 years before I actually wrote the book. And had I tried to write it at that point, it would have been a completely different book. When I was a legal aid lawyer for a little more than a decade, and I had a long commute at one point on a train, and I would think of stories, sometimes like novels that I wanted to write. And I was a poet. I wasn't writing any fiction, and sort of the very barest bones of this story came to me on a train. But all I saw was somebody walking out in the snow towards a pillar with no one else around, and finding a dog. And it kind of stuck with me. And then in 2019, when I started writing, I had been very sick for a few years. I became chronically ill. I still am in 2016 with neurological Lyme disease and a few other infections that it took a while to properly diagnose. And I was bedridden for a while. And when I became well enough to start writing, I started this novel. And at that point, I was very ill. I'd been isolated due to illness for a while. My best friend was developing pancreatic cancer. And while I was writing this, the pandemic hit, lockdown hit, my best friend died. So, and that was all while I was writing the book. And all of that extremely influenced the content and the way that the story went. The story is, at its base about grief and about complicated grief, but it's also about isolation and what it takes to, and the decision about whether or not to try to come out of isolation. And it was really influenced by my experience of not only grief, but of illness, anticipatory grief, more grief, isolation of lockdown.
Okay. You said your experience of complicated grief and illness was a crucible for this book.
How did grief first start to change the way you move through everyday life?
Maybe it's helpful to define what complicated grief is. Complicated grief, technically, it's a diagnosis, and it's when grief is so disabling that it interferes with daily life and goes on for a long time. And a lot of people actually experience this, and I've experienced it a few times in my life, most recently with my best friend. But for instance, when he and I was already sick and it was during lockdown, so I also didn't have the sort of structure of getting up and going to work already. But I barely got out of bed or got out of my room for probably 2 months. I stopped writing. I stopped working on the book. I was crying all the time, had feelings like I didn't want to go on if he wasn't there. These are sort of very common symptoms of complicated grief. And I'd experienced this before. I mean, I'd had it last longer when I was younger, but it's something that I don't think is talked about a lot, written about a lot. And I wanted to write something that would shed light on this, both for people that are going through it, like that it would be sort of comforting, and like that at one point when I was going through it, reading a couple of books that were written in the first person that were narratives about going through this. C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, which is a memoir of his mourning his wife, and Kitchen by Banani Yoshimoto, which is a novel. They really helped me. It sort of felt like the narrator was reaching out a hand and pulling me into their own experience of this. And grief is a very isolating, lonely place, especially if you're not around other people that are going through it at the same time. And I wanted to write something that would serve that purpose for people going through it, but also serve as a bit of an explanation for people who have not been through it, because most people at least know somebody who have been through it. And there's this tendency, I think, at least in this country, to feel like a discomfort when somebody is that deep in grief, sort of not wanting to look at it and also feeling like they should just kind of snap out of it, and wanted to just sort of have a book that sits in that space where people usually try to avoid.
Is it its own thing, or does it try to explain the intensity of grief when you explain complicated grief?
Is complicated grief different than just intense grief? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, well, a lot of, yes, because if somebody is grieving, of course, it's very intense to them. They lost a loved one. There's a connection that's gone.
Yeah.
And to some, they take it very intensely, and the loss, they're mourning. And is that in the same vein of complicated grief, or how you?
I mean, I'm not in the mental health field. To me, it's a spectrum of how people respond to things. I think as a diagnosis, it has more to do with how long it goes on and how much it interferes with activities of daily life. So somebody could feel like they are in extreme grief, but are able to get up, go to work, pick up their kid from school, do everything that they need to do. And they probably wouldn't be diagnosed as having complicated grief. I'm less interested in the medical terminology and the diagnosis, and just sort of more, I think that people who are grieving intensely and still able to function can still feel very isolated if they're not around other people that are grieving. So it's still applicable to me. I wanted to write something that was in that space for people that are experiencing it. The complicated grief part is just sort of the extremity of when it is disabling in terms of functioning on a day-to-day basis, or goes on for a very long time.
Yeah, it's a very interesting term. When I read it, I'm like, and I completely agree, because that's one of the reasons why, like, I do this, is because, I always say it, you can look at someone and never notice, like, the storm behind their eyes. They always have something going on. I was a part of that before I was able to, release a major trauma in my life. And it made me interested in telling other people's stories when they could think like, no, there's nothing here. I'm like, are you kidding me? Look at what you've been through. There is something there. And those that reflect on themselves always have that, we call them, gems or jewels and I want to give those to people, say, hey, look, you're not alone in what you're doing or what you're going through, rather. And I totally relate to that.
Yeah, and I've heard of this. The actual story in the book is about a grieving parent who goes to a sanctuary in subarctic Canada that's for people who are terminally ill that are going there to end their life. And part of it, it's a structure that allows a lot of things to be explored, but part of it was sort of the question of what happens if somebody is in this state and is like goes to a place where everybody is willing to look at it and actually deal with it, which is not something that most of us experience when we're going through it. What would it look like to be in that kind of setting or community?
In your conversations, you've pushed back on the idea of getting over grief. What's a more honest way to think about living with loss over time?
I mean, I think it's looked at differently in different communities and cultures. And I think the United States is a lot of communities and cultures, but I think that in general, there's this sense or expectation that people get over a loss or get over grief at some point. And I think I think this is very different in movies and literature from other countries, but in a lot of literature and film in the United States, if there's grief, it's sort of this arc, and often, in film over 90 minutes or something, where the expectation is by the end, the person is sort of lifted out of it and resolved and has come to some amazing conclusion where they're, ready to go on with a new perspective and happy. And I don't think that's what happens in most of our lives, especially with traumatic loss or intense loss. It's more of a question of what happens if it doesn't resolve and you feel very changed and you feel disoriented and you feel like there's something that's missing that will never be replaced in your life and you need to go on anyway. How do you do that? And what does it mean to go on anyway? And I feel like that is more of the question, and that's what's explored in the book. And the idea that maybe we don't need to expect that we're going to feel okay or okay all the time, that we can actually have a life, have meaning in our life, have respite from grief in certain periods, certain moments, but that on a larger sense that we may always feel like we're missing something or not entirely okay. And that a lot of people in the world go through life that way.
I know there's always a lot of nuances to healing, and to have that kind of fast forward in film, or like I try to always tell my kids, I'm like, okay, you're watching something, but the whole thing behind it, give that a little bit of thought, because there's always a bigger picture of whatever it is, something good, something bad, and to basically see the progression and to give them a fuller view rather than do like you can't always YouTube short your life, with all your experiences, and, trying to give them that sort of look with how the world turns. I think it's crucial for people to at least have an understanding of that.
Yeah. And I mean, for many reasons, including not feeling like there's something wrong with us if we aren't able to quickly move on, get over something, if our lives don't resolve in the way that the stories that are presented to us resolve.
To see a deep connection suddenly stop, and you've never been through that, I totally get it. Somebody be like, well, okay, they're not here, you're still living your life, you have other things to do, but wait, this is a cornerstone that just got pulled off of my whole foundation, and I need to learn how to grieve, especially if, like you said, if they never done that, and that does take time.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, part of what happened, the main character is in a kind of a numb state, which is when you're talking about learning how to grieve. I think it's hard to move forward at all without getting out of that numb state, and it sometimes
Absolutely.
takes help to get out of that numb state.
Yes, I can definitely attest to that. Now, ring threads and practices like breath work, ice bath, ETF tapping, and if I'm pronouncing this correctly, myofascial release.
Yeah.
What made you want to put body-based healing at the center of a literary novel and not just as a background detail?
So when I was first sick, it took about a year and a half to get properly diagnosed, and I was bedridden with fatigue. And I mean, I was told I had chronic fatigue syndrome, but that's just a syndrome. It wasn't what was causing it. And until I was properly diagnosed, I was looking for help, and I was treated online by a clinic in England that specializes in treating chronic fatigue syndrome. And they assigned me a nutritionist to talk about food and supplements, and they assigned me a psychology practitioner. And this is for a physical illness, right? For chronic fatigue syndrome. But part of their theory, and it was definitely true for me, is that in order to actually, for the body to be able to heal and the immune system to be able to kick in, the nervous system has to relax and has to be in a parasympathetic state and not a sympathetic state. And that a lot of people develop chronic fatigue syndrome and certain other illnesses have traumas that they haven't released and haven't dealt with. And so while I was doing some of these practices to try to calm my nervous system to help with the chronic fatigue syndrome, I started realizing that it was actually really helping me with traumas and grief that I hadn't actually been able to release or deal with before, despite having gone through things like talk therapy. And that a lot of trauma sits in the body. There's science about this, like, our emotions actually are, come from molecules that are stored in different parts of our body. And you can't really, one of the things that the person who started the clinic in England said, and something I was listening to was, the head is not, our mind is not separate from our body. Like, it's connected by our neck, like that. And that it's impossible to actually really deal with grief or trauma without actually addressing the body. And so I wanted to explore that in the book, partially because I wanted readers to be aware of some of these therapies and how helpful they are. And partially because, the character is in this very shut down state, and a state that I think realistically could really only be reached in part through therapies that address the body. I mean, this character was not going to sit down and talk therapy. And
yeah, I definitely, and a friend of mine, she always keeps pushing because it did have a huge impact on her. Maybe you've heard of the book, like The Body Keeps a Score.
Yes, not only have I heard of the book, I think I have a reference section, which is sort of unusual for a novel, but I have a reference section at the end of the book, and I think that's one of the books.
Yeah, that's on my get to list. Like, I really want to read that one. And yeah, and that is definitely true. Like, I suffer from Crohn's disease, and there's physical triggers, but yeah, there's also the mental triggers of my body reacting to if I'm in a certain situation. And I completely agree. If no one thinks that the two aren't linked because of what they're going through, then you got to go through more experiences, because they actually are linked. Like, I completely agree.
Have you ever heard of the ACEs study?
No, I
So
will write.
the ACEs, it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. There was a study, I don't know how long ago it was now. It may have even been 15 or 20 years ago. It was a while ago. Kaiser Permanente, because they're such a large insurer, HMO, and had, hundreds of thousands of records. They did this study looking at 10 specific childhood traumas and found that the more of these 10 traumas that somebody had, the more likely they were to have specific kinds of illnesses, including autoimmune disease, which, Crohn's is an autoimmune disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, a host of different physical illnesses. There's a very clear link between having these adverse experiences as a kid even, and developing these physical symptoms later on. The World Health Organization has expanded this, looked at it. There have been other practitioners and studies that have looked at other different kinds of trauma, but it's, there's no question that illness and trauma that hasn't been properly addressed are connected.
Interesting. I'll definitely check that out. And the C.S. Lewis book. What was the other one?
Kitchen. It's a novella by Banana Yoshimoto. She's a Japanese author. Actually, pretty much, I think that was her first book, and I read it decades ago. I don't know exactly how it would stand up now, but she's very prolific, and all of her books address grief. They're all fiction, but every single one of them is about grief. And I really recommend her work.
Check that one out. Now, how did writing about somatic practices affect your own relationship with your body after neurological Lyme and chronic?
I mean, all of the somatic practices that I wrote about are ones that I have engaged in that have been really helpful to me, except the ice baths. But I do follow, they're based on the work of Wim Hof, referred to as the Iceman. And I have actually practiced some of what he teaches. I've done cold showers and breathing exercises. I have not quite been able to get myself to fill a bathtub with ice water and sit in it. But I have felt, even just from working up to being in, an ice cold shower for a minute at a time, that it's had a big effect, not only on my body, but on my nervous system. That is very calming. So, I mean, writing about it, I would say that writing about it was more of a reflection of the effect that these things had on me. But, my best friend died when I was probably 3/4 of the way through this book. I stopped writing for a while. And the fact that I had been writing it, I think, served as kind of a reminder and a guide to me of what I needed to do to help myself when I was in such a state of grief about his death. And I think I probably moved out of the disabling or disabled part of that faster because I had been writing about this, and because I had sort of created my own guidebook for get up and do these things and it's going to help you.
I totally agree. Well, one, on the ice bath, I remember when my wife and I went to this, I forgot what it's called. I know it's called Airy. They have a bunch all around, and I can't get past my thighs. I can't. She was swimming like a fish, and she was like, "Oh, it's so refreshing." Me, I'm like, I'm going to the heated pool. I'm good. But I do like to try that every once in a while, the whole cold shower thing. And with the whole grief, like the way you described it, and it was not as, to that level, but me going through some complications in my life, stepping away from the podcast, and it felt like it felt like that. It felt like I was grieving it. Like, I have to get back to this. If not, if I walk away from it and it is completely gone. And I did the same thing. I said, no, I have to start doing this. I have to start doing this. I'm doing this for myself, getting these different views and all the strengths that people share. And I'm like, wait, this is a little form of therapy for myself, along with what I'm also doing on, outside of this. Yeah, I definitely see that. And people need to do something. Like, they really need to do something.
Dealing with grief is sort of an ongoing practice. It's not something that you necessarily do in order to get over something. It's something that you do on an ongoing basis, possibly for the rest of your life, in order to get through it. And not through grief, but through life. And that's sort of the constant working on it and working to calm your nervous system. And it just needs to become a part of your life, or a practice. Like, dealing with grief can be an ongoing practice rather than a specific period in your life.
Especially with those who have to deal with suicide, and they may not have an answer as to why this person did what and remove themselves from their lives. And not many people get an answer. Family member disappears, or all these horrible stories. And there's rarely any closure, and you have to create that own closure to be able to get up in the morning, having to deal with everything that's in your life and, put one foot in front of the other. Yeah, completely agree.
Or maybe it's not closure. Maybe it's literally just a practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the bond between Lee and the dog, Ring, carries so much emotional weight. What kind of healing or conflict were you able to explore through a human-animal relationship that would have landed differently with another person in that role?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there's a few things. I mean, part of the main, I guess, conflict in the book. I mean, the main character has lost their daughter already at the beginning of the book and does not want to live, and encounters this dog who, to some degree, in the main character's mind, needs rescuing. Like, a terminally ill person has brought the dog to the sanctuary. That the way that people end their lives is through these kind of ritualized walks out in the snow, and he's planning to take the dog with him, even though the dog's not sick. And the conflict is the main character feeling the need to rescue someone else while not wanting to go on themselves, and how you sort of reconcile those two things, and what it makes you think about, like, about the value of living, and also the logistics of saving someone else when you're in the process of not saving yourself. And that seemed easier to explore with an animal who does not have the same kind of agency as an adult human, that it really is an issue of, am I going to save this being or not? But also, the main character is very shut down, and animals, I think, have an ability to connect with us in nonverbal and very direct ways. Like, their emotions are very on the surface. that can allow somebody who is too shut down to want to communicate with other humans to be able to actually connect on an emotional level and start coming out of their shell a bit. And, I've definitely had that experience in my own life with grief and with other things that where, periods of time where animals have sort of been my main comfort and help. And it's even that, if you're so grief stricken or dealing with some other kind of trauma that you can't get out of bed, it's something that's very frightening to other people that are close to you, people that are not close to you. It's like a very emotionally difficult thing for them to be in that space with you. And for a cat, for instance, having somebody who doesn't want to get out of bed is like the best thing ever. Like most of them want to stay in bed 23 hours a day, and to like have company and somebody to like scratch their head. Like they're totally there with you. Like they don't find it difficult to associate with you because you don't want to get out of bed. And it's just a very different kind of relationship. And I think it can actually help to get out of bed if you have somebody who's sort of treating you like you're normal, even though you're not getting out of bed.
Yeah, I like we're a dog family, so we have a dog, and he's still young, and he has this little thing of where, and I guess a lot of dogs do that, where he goes from each individual person and goes to their rooms like, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay? You got a treat? Okay, you're okay? All right, cool. I'm gonna go over here. Oh wait, I heard something. Are you okay? And so it feels like he's doing that, but
And
he's
if
a
you're
young.
not okay, it's a magnet, right? Like he goes
Yes.
to you, whereas people might be like, you okay? Like, do I really want to go over there? But the
Yeah, exactly.
dogs and their needs, this is the other thing about a dog, is having to attend to a dog's needs, like forces you to get up and do things. Like there have been periods both in my illness and with grief where I had to walk my dog, and that's the only thing that got me out of bed. And I couldn't just tell the dog to go walk himself.
Yeah.
And that can also help to have an animal that you have to take care of.
It's funny enough, this morning we get up early, I drop my kid off at the bus, one of my kids, and we have a backyard, and it's like, all right, we'll take Robbie for a walk, but let him go out in the backyard, and he does the, hey, wait, he gives that look like, you're not coming out with me. I'm like, give me a second, I'll be right there. I go out with him, get in the cold. I'm in Westchester in New York, so I get the cold air right now, and I'm just standing out there, just taking it in. I'm watching him, he's looking at me. I'm like, go do your business, taking it in and getting that rush of nature and everything like that.
And being in the
know,
moment, right? I mean,
yes.
that's part of it too with the animals, is that, especially when we're going through something, and this is a lot of what the book is about, actually. Like we get to a point where we're sort of not noticing our body, the world around us, nature, sort of anything that's happening in moment to moment. And it's really hard to spend a lot of time with an animal, I think especially a dog, and not notice what's going on around you. They're so in the moment. I mean, they take you outside, and the dog in the book, sort of a lot of the function that the dog serves in the story is sort of bringing the person sort of to their senses, literally, like experiencing the world through their senses in a way that they had really shut down.
And there was one, I saw it on Instagram. It might have been Instagram, where someone posted up a nice little graphic where you see the picture of the guy sitting with his dog, and the thought bubble of the guy is everything that he's dealing with. You got a whole bunch of little things, and you see the other side of the photo where the dog is, and the thought bubble is of him and his owner just sitting there, and he's just like, so I'm like, crap, like, yeah, we got to be in the present, Then I'm like, okay, and then I took him out for a walk, and I'm like, okay, people worry about too much of things that haven't happened or not gonna happen or might happen. Like, no, bring your butt back to the present. Like, be there. And they're a great example of, like, they're just there. Like,
Yeah.
That great.
And I think for me, that is one of the best and most important ways of being able to go on while grieving or while carrying trauma, is to be able on a daily basis to actually exist in the world. Like the grief or the trauma is still there, but when you're actually seeing, hearing, feeling what is around you, the impact is very different.
Now, Ring is spare, lyrical, and less driven by traditional plots than by internal shifts. How did your background in poetry and your reading life shape the voice and structure you choose?
I feel like the structure chose me, honestly, and I think it's probably largely because I'm a poet. When I first was thinking about sitting down to actually write this story, I kept not doing it because I'd never written a novel. I hadn't written fiction since I was in high school. You know, I was a poet and I was a lawyer. I wrote expository writing. And I could not conceive of how to structure this in sort of the traditional novel form of chapters with a backstory and the 3-act way that you're supposed to write a novel and the particular kind of story arc. And what happened is I picked up a book of essays. Actually, I got it out of the library from Susan Sontag. These were essays from the 1960s. Like, they should not have seemed that radical. But one of the essays was about novels and how novelists had not developed in the way that other artists or even poets had in terms of breaking down the conventions of the craft. Like, you know, with painting, there was, for a long time, everything strove to be realistic, and then there was impressionism and abstract, and, you know, and just a constant challenging of what happens if we take this element away, what happens if we take this one away. It happens in music, it's happened in poetry. And she was saying, but it wasn't really happening very much in fiction or in novels, and that what we think of as a novel and all the elements you have to have is just sort of a historical accident about how this form of writing developed, and there's no real reason why it has to be that way. And she was encouraging novelists to try throwing out some of these conventions. And I finished that essay, I closed the book, and I started this novel because I realized that I could just write what I wanted to write. And it's written in a series of vignettes instead of chapters. It's just sort of one vignette after another. Some of them are very short. Most of them are at most a few pages, and they're kind of like scenes, basically, rather than chapters. I do think that being a poet probably influenced the way that came to me and the way that I wrote it, and certainly the lyrical language. The first draft of the novel was actually a lot shorter and a lot sparer and had very little backstory. You know, I ended up going and adding some things in, but I think I was very influenced by being a poet and just by not being able to see this story in a traditional structure, and getting permission from this writer who wrote this in the 1960s to write something that, you know, I'm listening to somebody who was saying this in the 1960s, and when I wrote this, it was called experimental, you know, like in 2021 or whenever I finished it, which is kind of, you know, ironic. I mean, it's 60 years after she was saying these things.
And that's great that you can bring that into what you're doing. Now, moving from a demanding law career to full-time writing after your illness is a huge pivot. What did you have to grieve or let go to make that transition possible?
Well, it's not after my illness, because I'm still disabled. I'm
Yes.
still ill. I'm much better than I was, but I would never be able to go back to practicing law or to working full time. And I don't write full time either, because I'm not really able to do anything full time. But in some ways, it's ironic. In some ways, I don't think I had to give up or grieve something in order to be able to shift to writing. It was like, I mean, I never liked being a lawyer. I was a public interest lawyer. I went into law because I wanted a tool to continue social justice work. And I was a legal aid lawyer. I did some environmental law. I did some animal law. And I absolutely believed in what I was doing and do not regret any of it. But I hated the practice of law, you know, the sort of the day-to-day, the fighting with people all the time, the way that writing had to be and thinking had to be structured. And from even while I was in law school, I had the desire for, 20 years to not be a lawyer. But of course, once I'd graduated from law school, I said, I should do this. And the deeper I got into it and the more experienced I was, because I believed in what I was doing, the harder it was to extricate myself, because I felt like I have even more of these skills now. I should be using them to help people. And what I had really wanted to do my whole life was to write, but I hadn't really given myself permission to do that. And, ironically, getting sick gave me the permission to do that. I mean, when I was first sick, I wouldn't even be able to write. Like I was having vision problems. I didn't have the energy literally even to write. But when I recovered enough that I could write on and off, and I still couldn't do something like go back to work in the law. I would say it enabled me to do it. Like it was not, I did not feel like I was giving something up. I felt like I had been given permission to do this, and probably the only way I would ever have allowed myself to, which is kind of a sad statement in and of itself, because I realize at this point that it shouldn't have taken getting gravely ill to feel like I had permission to write.
I mean, I feel that like I had to start over. I started as a office assistant, ended as a paralegal, did 13
Are you
years
in law
in,
too?
yeah, and in the legal field, and then switching gears, my job being outsourced while having a second child, and switching gears, going back to college in my 30s to be in IT. And I'm like, what the hell am I doing? And now at 47, you're putting my weight towards being a podcaster, have a children's book out, and doing all these things. And I'm like, should I be doing this at this age? Like, what's going on? But, a lot of my friends and colleagues would tell me, they're like, look, man, you already know it's a journey. It's a journey. This is what's been put in front of you. If it doesn't go away in a certain amount of time, then you know that that's something that you're going to have to process and put forth and see what comes out of it, because if it's not going away, something's coming out of it. And so, yeah, like, I'm glad I was done with that life. And a lot of good people, but you're right, it's overly structured. You have to do it this way, the hierarchy, and just watching them maneuver, and I'm like, I don't want to be a part of this. Like, I
No, I mean,
don't.
it's okay for some people. Like that is
Yeah,
what
that's for them. Yeah. But I totally agree with that. I am not looking back at that life at all. I take what I got from it, and, like, all right, that's the past.
but you probably wouldn't have just stepped out of it all of a sudden on your own, right? Like it kind of had to be forced on you.
Exactly. I definitely take it as a necessity of what I had to go through life. And wherever this journey takes me, when I wake up, let's see what's going on for the day. And, I love it. Each interview that I do, and getting everyone's perspective. And even though for me, I'm saying the same thing in a sense of like my story, but then I'm like, I look back at it and I'm like, well, it's my story and it led me to this point, and I'm
Yeah.
proud of it.
And it affects what happens, what happens now, right? Like, I mean, a part of me feels like, what was I doing? Like, I should have been writing the whole time. But on the other hand, this book, like my debut book, would not have been the book that it is had I not gone through everything I went through, including my illness, even. I mean, I don't know what writing would have meant if I had done it instead of all the other things that I did instead of after.
It's the weird thing, because with my progression and understanding what you just said, it's like me doing what I'm doing. And then once we moved into this house, going through the pandemic, having our third child, and I used to do something called Amazon Flex, which is basically you're doing independent contractor delivering for Amazon. I was just doing that to make some side money. And one of my biggest traumas was basically sexual abuse by a family member when I was younger. And what happens is you get a route, you get your packages, you deliver it, and I shit you not, in that one specific time, the last drop off was at the apartment building, the same floor, but not the same apartment of where my trauma happened. Yeah. And, if that wouldn't have happened, then I told my wife, I said, look, this is what's going on. And I just need a little bit of time. She's like, I understand. I said, look, I'm okay. I'm not freaking out. I let this affect me for decades. And so once I was processing that, I don't know where I went. And I'm still trying to figure that out. Like, where did I go? I don't know if I went to a park or something or whatever, or just stayed in the car. And that's when the idea of the podcast came to me. It just boom, everything, the name of it, what I want to do, why I want to do it. And I just jumped on it full tilt. And I say that because if I didn't do that, then I wouldn't have met this individual. Her name's Maria Trusa. That's the one I was telling you about, the book. She loves that book, The Body Keeps the Score. And her son and another individual, that they do these retreats. And when I went on that retreat, I released it. I was given the roadmap of basically saying you finally have to realize it's not your fault and you have to more forgive yourself than even if you want to forgive the other person. And that was a game changer for me. And that put me on a journey of healing that like I'm not stopping, and helped fix a lot of things in my life and made me aware of like, you know what, you have to prioritize yourself and learn to continue to heal on your journey wherever it's taking you. Don't worry about the goal, just enjoy the journey. So it's just how weird it happens. So many times I would have just shut down, walked away, and wait until I was ready to just reintroduce myself back into the world, a little beat up, but functional. But I guess life was telling me, or the universe was like, you got to stop doing that.
Yeah.
It's hurting you, it's hurting your wife, it's hurting your kids, and it's not good for your life. And that's where it led me.
Yeah.
So that was very interesting to see where it all came from, and I'm glad for it. So I tell people, recognize your journey, recognize it, no matter what you're going through, and just keep walking it. It'll be interesting. Something will happen, be positive. Now, for someone listening who is in the thick of grief or chronic illness, what is one small compassionate practice you'd invite them to try? Something that doesn't require them to be strong or over it yet.
I think can I say two things? Like one sort of
Say whatever you want.
sort of larger thing is I really recommend EFT tapping, which is a practice where you tap on specific acupressure points on your face and torso. There's videos online. It's more helpful to do it with a practitioner. But a very easy thing to do, probably the easiest, and that can be done over and over throughout the day, is just to feel where your feet are on the floor, where your legs are touching a seat. There's a certain number of things that I think to look around and notice 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, I think 3 things that you can feel, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 that you can taste, I think. But even if you don't do that number of things, the point is to actually, and you can do this in 30 seconds, to literally feel your feet, feel if you're on a chair, feel the part of you that's against the chair, or feel what's on the floor, and look around and like use every one of your senses in the environment that you're in. And it is incredible what that does to the nervous system, and just sort of pulling you out of the ruminations in your mind and sort of back into the world for 30 seconds. And it's something you can do anywhere with, nobody would know that you're doing it. You can do it 20 times a day. It doesn't take any training. You don't need a practitioner. You don't have to get through the entire thing just to actually notice what your body is feeling. Because it's kind of, I'm sitting right now in this interview and saying this, I'm suddenly aware of my feet right against the floor. Like generally, they've been there the whole time, but I'm sort of very good at sort of not being aware of my body at all. And it does something to our nervous system to actually feel our bodies.
I get it. I do that with my hands. I look at my hands and I'm just flexing them, and I don't know why I do it, but I just do it. And, I get it, just to be aware and be there. And my wife, she loves the EFT tapping, and I don't know if it goes by another name, but yeah, she's done the tapping one. She raves about it. She's like, you got to try it. I'm like,
it works differently for different people. I've met people who tried it and didn't feel like it helped. For me, I think it is the modality that helps me the most. Like literally, if I go through one round of that, I feel like I've taken a tranquilizer or something. It's incredible. And one of the ways that we release energy that's stored in our body is by yawning. And when I tap, especially with a practitioner, like it's incredible. Like sometimes even just when I'm preparing to tap or thinking about tapping, I just start yawning uncontrollably. Like it's just this like release of energy. I find it incredibly effective, but different things work for different people.
I'm in the market for a new therapist. I want to switch gears. Because of what I went through, I always picked women, and this time I'm going to switch gears and try therapy with a man and see how that goes, and just get out of that, not a rut, but get out of the path that I carved myself, that, you know what, let me try something different. Let me experiment a little with seeing how that healing will go in a different way. And I think people should take your suggestions to heart because once you're uncomfortable in such a good way, you see things happening. You see different things going on, and that makes you grow. I feel.
I also think, I mean, there's the uncomfortable way, but I think for some people being introduced to somatic therapies like tapping or things like hypnosis or cold therapy or things like that can be less uncomfortable, that some people either don't seek help or don't get a lot out of help because it feels so uncomfortable to actually talk about things or after a while talking about the same trauma over and over. I mean, I've had this. It can be helpful. Like, I absolutely do not want to denigrate talk therapy. And I have at times gotten a lot out of it and been helped by it, while in crisis. But at a certain point, at least for some people, I think talking about the same thing over and over again doesn't actually help that much and can feel uncomfortable. Whereas doing something that actually releases the pent up energy in the body that is attached to the trauma without having to keep talking about it can be less uncomfortable.
I agree, because I want to, every time I have a therapist, it's more of, tell me what you're going through, this or that. And I'm guessing, and I'm trying to find someone that is in a sense like me, where if I'm talking to someone and getting super curious and my mind turns to think like, okay, how can I have a better conversation with this person? How can I want to be interested in what their life is. And when you have somebody that's seen and heard, and they're like, you see them pick up and they're like, they want to tell you everything. I'm like, all right, give it to me, tell me what's up, and then you find those connections and everything. And, I'm basically like, I'm mirroring what I would want, and I'm definitely trying to find it. So, yeah, I guess that's my other path, another journey to continue for my healing. And people should really, if they get uncomfortable and don't want to do it and continue, it's like, okay, then find the right thing. There's so many different, way more than there were in the past. There's so many different ways that you can explore this, get curious about your healing. I love when people do that. And I say,
Yeah.
please continue, continue. You don't know what you're going to get out of it. And then something beautiful is going to grow from that. So that,
Have you heard of Wim Hof, the person that I was
yes,
referring to? Yeah.
yes.
So he developed his therapies, which have nothing to do with talking. I mean, they're all about the nervous system, right? With heat and cold and breath and everything. But he developed them because his wife took her own life, and he had, I think, 4 kids that he had to raise, and he was dealing with a lot of grief and trauma, but had to be there for his kids. And he would go for a walk every day, and he started, I think he's from the Netherlands, and it was cold, and he would walk past this lake or pond or something, and one day he just took off his clothes and got in it, like out of this just sort of desperate feeling, and spent time in this really cold water. And when he got out, his nervous system was so much more relaxed. It helped him go on with his day and take care of his kids. And he started doing it on a regular basis as a way of coping with what he was going through. And then he developed this whole sort of, trainings and practices out of it. But, there are ways to help yourself heal or move through things, relax your nervous system, that don't have to involve telling your story over and over again to somebody.
Absolutely. Now, what do you hope readers carry with them after finishing Ring, not just about loss, but about their own capacity for connection and meaning?
I hope that people feel less alone and also more able to actually look directly at difficult emotions and difficult feelings, either their own or somebody else that's going through them. I mean, a lot of happens in the book is actually conversations, but they're very they're conversations that don't shy away from sort of the core difficulties that people are going through. I had beta readers, like people that read the manuscript when it was done before it was published, and some who I didn't know. And somebody, one of the people I didn't know who read it, who was in another country, she wrote to me afterwards that when she finished the book, like she just was really craving having having these sort of deeper conversations with people, that she got something out of reading these conversations and looked around and felt like she needed that in her own life and was looking for them. And that touched me. And I think that is something that I hope that at least some people take away from the book, is that it doesn't have to be terrifying to look at what we or other people are going through and connect about it.
Yeah. And everybody craves that connection, and I hope they, like you said, I hope they feel curious about it and everything. So, and finally, where can listeners find the book, follow your work, and if they want to stay connected to these conversations on grief, healing, and representation, like where can they go?
The book can be, I like to direct people or a lot of independent bookstores. You can order any book online, even if through them, even if they don't have it. The paperback, right now, the ebook or Kindle version and the audiobook, I think, are only available on Amazon and Audible. I'm hoping that they can be available through other places. I prefer to recommend that people get things other than on Amazon, but they are available on Amazon also. Libraries, a lot of libraries have the book, and if they don't, you can request that your library order it. I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question? If I have
And if
I
they,
do
yeah,
have a website, I am extremely bad at updating it. The book was half a month ago already. The book was long listed for a big national award, which is probably like the pinnacle of my literary career, and the Aspen Words Literary Prize, and that is not on my website. I don't think anything that's happened in the last 3 months is on my website. I will eventually update it, but it does have some information about the book and me, and it has some of my poetry. I have another book that's coming out next year that's a memoir that I will hopefully post things soon about.
So, Michelle, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for sharing your story and your book. And I really appreciate all the time that you've given me.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you felt something during this conversation, a moment of recognition, a breath you didn't realize you were holding, or even that warm ache of being understood, that's the gift Michelle brings. She reminds us that grief isn't a finish line. It's a practice, something we learn to live with, not something we magically solve. And she showed us that healing doesn't always begin in the mind. Sometimes it begins in the body, in the feet on the floor, the breath you forgot to take, the tapping that quiets your nervous system, the cold water that shocks you back into yourself, or the dog who sits beside you because he doesn't need you to be okay. He just needs you to be there. Michelle also reminds us that creativity doesn't come from perfection. It comes from survival, from curiosity, from paying attention to life you're actually living, even the painful parts, and giving yourself permission to shape something meaningful out of it. And maybe the biggest message of all is this: you don't have to be strong to start healing. You just have to be here, to feel your feet on the ground, to notice what's around you, to take one small moment of presence, even 30 seconds, and let that be enough for today. Until the next time, stay gentle, stay curious, and remember, whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. Adelante, siempre por tu mente. Forward, always for your mind. This is the FYI I Am Damaged podcast. Meet Logan, the strong-minded little elephant who learns that bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about believing in yourself even when you're scared. In this beautifully illustrated story, friends follow Logan through a colorful jungle as he learns to calm his worries, take deep breaths, and remind himself, I am strong, I am safe, I can do this. It's a story that helps kids, and maybe a few grown-ups too, find courage, mindfulness, and strength in their hearts. Logan, the strong-minded little elephant, by me, Oscar Luna. Available now at all major retailers and my publisher's bookstore, Milton and Hugo. Because it's up to every parent to show that their child deserves to know that strength starts from within.